obviously you're expecting pictures of cuddly polar bear cubs or something like that. And I hope you won't be disappointed. It's my great pleasure to have Elizabeth McLanahan here today. I'm not going to do the introduction though. I'm just the organizer of the series. I'm Trevor Branch. I'm going to hand over to our Deputy Director here. Tim Essington, the Associate Director, Tim Essington, to give the introduction.
Thanks, Trevor. So it's a real great pleasure to be able to introduce Elizabeth today. You know, like a lot of folks that get to give introductions, they have sort of a long professional history with the speaker, and they can tell some embarrassing stories. But I met Elizabeth this morning, so my introduction is very brief. But I had a very fascinating discussion to learn all about what her office works on and what she works on. She put it really nicely and succinctly that essentially what she gets to do is identify problems and identify solutions and then be a leader in trying to make those things happen. So I've got a few notes because I know I won't remember everything. It says right up here, she's the acting director of NOAA's Office of International Affairs, and when she's not the director, she's the deputy director, and I think right now she's both. Is that right? Yeah, so NOAA's cost saving in action. If you're like me, you might not have known too much about this office, what the Office of International Affairs does, and I'm guessing Elizabeth will tell us a little bit about it, but I was really impressed with the type of things that they do. Essentially, they're sort of on the front line, sort of representing U.S. interests in international negotiations that center around any type of environmental policy. So, say there's some decision document being drawn on something like high seas bottom trawling. Elizabeth is literally the person in the room who is representing U.S. interests and making sure that the decisions are consistent with the goals of U.S. policy. Just a quick bio, she did her undergraduate at Dartmouth, I'm going by memory there. Okay. Yeah, and got 2 simultaneous master's degrees at Duke, one in forestry and the other in environmental management. Like many people, she didn't dream when she was a child of being an upper-level administrator in international affairs. She was convinced that she was going to be a geneticist, and then when she went to college, she was fascinated with the idea of adventures of field work, so she was going to be a naturalist field biologist. So now she gets to travel the world and visit conference rooms that don't have any windows in lieu of adventurous field work. So please join me in welcoming, I should mention that in addition to Arctic, she also does lots of interesting work in the Coral Triangle and also West Africa. So maybe after at our social, you can ask me questions about that too. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks. I think there was another synopsis of my job that I gave, which says something along those lines of modifying budgets, managing people that aren't working well together, a few other tedious duties. But we do also get to do some interesting stuff, which is the international negotiation. I just want to start off, when Trevor invited me to come speak at this series, the immediate thought that came to my mind when he said, oh, the topic is should we eat fish? And I worked for a guy for a long time who did most of his work in Antarctica. And all I remember is when I first started, he was telling me this story of being at the market. He was at the fish counter line. And this is back in the days when Patagonian toothfish, which we also call Chilean sea bass, that's his prettier name. The woman lying in front of him was ordering it. So he kind of stops her and he says, ma'am, I need to tell you, the fish, it's not really a very sustainable stock. Maybe you want to think about ordering something else. There's not many left of them. She kind of looks at him and she pauses and she stares and she says, well, if there are not many left, I better order 2 now before they're all gone. So for me, the question isn't really should we eat fish, but how can we eat fish sustainably? Because people really are going to be eating it forever. I don't think that's going to stop or change. Okay, so in this regard, in my presentation, I'll try to paint a portrait of the Arctic as a whole. Where is it? What is it? How is it changing? What is climate change doing to it? What are some of the activities that are taking place there right now? And what are some of the uncertainties that are associated with it? And also we'll look at what some of the management measures are that are in place and how we're using some of the science to identify the gaps and what more needs to be done. Most of the maps that we see look at the world from the equator, but instead let's try to look at it from the North Pole, looking straight down. Over here we obviously have Russia. We have Alaska in here, and this is the long Aleutian chain. Here's Canada with the Canadian archipelago, obviously Greenland, which is part of Denmark. And then we have Iceland, and over here we have the European countries, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And then trying to define the Arctic. This is always difficult. There's a few different ways that it's done. You can see where the Arctic Circle proper is, at 66 and a little bit of change north. People also look at it from the environmental side of where is the isotherm 10 degrees in July. And then lastly, more of what I deal with is how governments actually define it. And that's quite different from what it might be done in environmental or other terms. The United States, we define the Arctic coming way down here into our Aleutian chain, whereas you have other countries like Norway over here, which instead they define it higher up, closer to the Svalbard Islands, which they also own, because they think that the properties like the ice, the climate, etc., is more characteristic of the Arctic further up north there. And then just to give you a few of the visual images of the Arctic, it has a delicate balance here of sea ice, along with things like water and icebergs. And you've got the species that live on it or depend on it in order to be able to forage for food, or they might live beneath it. And you also have the people that coexist with it. We can't forget about the indigenous people that live there. We've got indigenous groups like the Sami, the Aleut, the Inuit, who hunt and fish and survive off the area. So what's happening in Arctic? I think everyone here is familiar with climate change. You're an environmental group. But what you can see is this is looking again from the top of the North Pole looking down. And here you have temperatures on average of about 3 degrees higher, whereas the rest of the world tends to be changing somewhere on the order of 0 to 1 degree. So you can see here in the Arctic, we're warming a lot faster than the rest of the world. Climate change is also impacting sea ice extent. Sea ice extent can be defined as covering the ice extending out over the water. Here in the month of March, you can see that there's fairly robust cover. That's because it's the end of winter, so the ice extent is covering most of the Arctic Ocean. Whereas here in September, you can see it's shrunk. This is the end of summer. So with the warmer temperatures, it has reduced a lot more. One of the other problems that we are facing is sea ice extent over time, length of time that is. We have satellite imagery that goes back to 1979, and 2012 represents the lowest in the satellite record. It's 18% lower than in 2007, when the previous record was recorded. And overall, 2012 was only about 3.3 million kilometers squared, or 49% below the 1979 to 2000 average minimum of about 6.7. And the age of ice is declining as well. What you see in March of 1998, you can see a lot of this kind of more white color, and that means it's what's called 5-year or older ice. When you look at these other grades, you see much more blue, which means there's younger, 1 to 2 year ice. And what that happens from is because when you already have ice existing, and then it snows more on top of it, it keeps piling up and compressing and getting thicker and harder. On the other hand, when you have that sea ice extent shrinking and melting during the summer, so you have open water, what happens is you get this really very thin single-year ice, which means it can melt faster, it can be broken more easily if you want to take a ship through it. And so it has a lot of environmental implications for being able to melt away more quickly and thus to keep reducing our sea ice extent. And worse yet, new models are predicting that by 2035, only about 20 years from now, the Arctic could be nearly sea ice free in summer, whereas not long ago they thought it wouldn't happen until about 2100 at the earliest. So it's happening a lot faster than even the models had predicted earlier. So what are some of the possible increased uses in the Arctic? And what does this mean for the resources? In short sum, we're going to see more access probably more extraction and more impacts on the environment. I feel terrible saying this. I know Iris said that there's, I guess, one of your kind of chat groups, and people were saying, oh, I'm so depressed after reading some of the articles and hearing about this. So I apologize that it isn't better news, but it's probably the likelihood of what's going to happen. Some of the activities that we'll see are oil and gas drilling, shipping, including things like cruise tourism and fisheries as well. So I'll try to cover these so you understand how the multiple drivers come together and impact the ecosystem and some of the dynamics between the countries. I don't want you to get too hung up on this chart. There are a few terms that I do use in my presentation. I just want you to be aware of what they mean in general terms. On the far left-hand side, this is basically land, and here you are moving further out into the ocean. What you can see is here countries have something called their exclusive economic zone. All of the Arctic countries have claimed their exclusive economic zone, so it means out to 200 nautical miles. They have rights to do things like go fishing, take the fish, harvest genetic resources. They also can drill for oil and do things down here in the seabed. Beyond 200 nautical miles, you can claim what's called an extended continental shelf. And if you can prove, based on certain characteristics, that this is an extension of your continental shelf, it also means you basically get the ownership over doing things like drilling for resources out here, further out than 200 nautical miles. But the water column, which is above all this area, is always going to be, quote unquote, for everybody. So you don't, even if you get the continental shelf, you don't get sort of ownership over fisheries or resources here in the water column. A little bit of a generalization on some of these, and your lawyers. Just trying to simplify it though. So first, let me start by looking at the oil and gas operations. On the map, you can see where both terrestrial and marine oil and gas activity is taking place by looking at the red dots. Sorry, it's not entirely clear, but again, here you've got Russia and here you've got Alaska. Extensive oil and gas activity has occurred in the Arctic, mainly on land and mostly in Russia so far, which amazingly has produced about 80% of the oil and 99% of the gas extracted in the Arctic so far. The Arctic is known to contain large petroleum hydrocarbon reserves, much of which, about 75% of known Arctic oil and 90% of known gas, are, you guessed it, also in Russia. So they'll continue to be a dominant force when it comes to things like oil and gas drilling. Norway is next in terms of exploration and production, both of oil and gas, and doing this both onshore and offshore as well. Canada, the US, and Iceland and Greenland are all in various stages when it comes to offshore exploration and production, but they don't obviously come anywhere near like with Russia. Greenland is a very interesting situation. I don't know how many of you are very familiar with Greenland, but it's part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And they were granted home rule back in, I think, 1979. And then later on, they started to be given more autonomy based on a vote that they took in 2007. And one of the interesting facts is that they still receive about $600 million US dollars a year in subsidies from the Kingdom of Denmark in order to help them out. But that money is going to phase out over time as they start to become more independent and as they're able to start extracting more oil and gas resources and having their own source of income. So the pressure will really be on in places like Greenland to start extracting more oil and gas based on this. From a United States government perspective, we've been trying to work with them on a bilateral basis, helping them set up monitoring programs for marine mammals, also try to share our information about how we do oil and gas drilling, etc. So it's a little bit scary to think about though. What are some of the uncertainties associated with oil and gas? Like how much is there? Again, don't get too hung up on this, but this was a USGS assessment that looked at the probability of oil and gas. And basically what it summarizes is that the mean estimates for each province, because it was broken down into 33 different regions, but the mean estimates are that 90 billion barrels of oil, about 1,700 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, 44 billion barrels of natural gas could possibly be found in the Arctic. And of that, about 84% would be offshore. So it's really the marine environment that could get impacted by this. Although these reserves probably exist, and there are some known reserves, as we heard earlier, we don't know what current technology will do, how far it will advance, will it be able to allow us to drill in more ice-covered waters, how deep into the ocean will it allow us to drill. So there's a lot of those uncertainties still. Also don't know what the demands are going to be from a commercial standpoint. Is it affected by alternative energy, wars, etc.? So a lot of that we have left to see. And then lastly, there's always politics. I obviously am sort of, I guess, living in Washington, D.C., I feel it every day, and I don't know to what extent people here follow it. But there has always been this tension between sort of industry versus environment. And usually when the Democrats are in power, sort of environment gets a little bit higher, and when the Republicans are in power, usually it's a little less pro-conservation. But more recently, what we're seeing as a trend is pretty interesting. It's now following the lines of sort of energy security or energy independence, just because of all the wars we've been having around the world. So that's really factoring into some of the decisions. Here, we can look at sort of the fight over ownership. It's actually interesting here in the bottom corner, it might be a little bit hard to see, but that's actually a titanium flag being planted by a Russian submersible. And it gained a lot of attention, probably because Chilingarov, who was one of the explorers that was on this mission, he stirred up the hornet's nest and he declared, when you kind of asked what is Russia doing, the Arctic has always been Russian! And he's just sort of inflamed crowds left and right. But it came out in the press afterwards that the expedition was actually rather international, because it was initiated by an Australian entrepreneur, a retired submarine captain, and it was funded by a Swedish pharmaceuticals tycoon. So at the end of the day, we, as Arctic countries, have always said that we will go ahead and we'll settle any differences we have about who owns different areas, such as the North Pole and other parts of the Arctic, by doing it through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So we're peaceable countries, we're not going to go to war over this. But the one interesting side note is that the United States is the only Arctic country that hasn't approved the Law of the Sea. And once again, that's because of our Congress, and there's a lot of fear about ceding any of our powers over to UN organizations and what this means for our own sovereignty if we go ahead and join to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So, we're going to hang up there. Next, we'll try to look at the status of shipping. What you see, we have about 6,000 vessels in the Arctic area, which is quite a lot, as you can imagine, but about 3,000 of them, turn around for a second, there's the ocean chain. A lot of them are going from sort of your hometown here of Seattle and scooping around our lower US Arctic over to Asia. So about half, 3,000 vessels or more up in the high Arctic area that we're worried about. The lines you see here, we've got different passages through and across the Arctic. Over here is the Canadian side, so we have the Northwest Passage. Over here is what's called the Northern Sea Route, which follows the Russian coast. If you move goods from like Shanghai over to the Netherlands versus going here through the Suez Canal, it saves about 22% in time, and it saves a lot in bunker fuel as well. So you can see what the incentive is to try and go across the Arctic if we can, if the sea ice melts enough for us to do it more easily. Before going through the slides, I have to thank our WWF friends, because I've been trying for a few years now to pry data out of the Norwegian Satellite Agency unsuccessfully, because the satellites have sort of revolutionized how we collect data. We did a big assessment a number of years ago trying to look at all the ship traffic data, practically by hand. We're like entering all the vessel tracks and where the ships were going. Now satellite data, I mean, it's amazing when you can put together quite easily. Not all of it, they're still in the process of compiling data, so it's not all right, so don't get too hung up, especially over in this area where there are some mistakes. But what you're looking at right now is fishing data, so you can see the huge concentrations of where fishing is taking place up here off of the north coast of Norway and around Svalbard, especially around Iceland and Faroes, over here in Greenland. Of course, there's active fisheries over here in Bering, Alaska. Here, these are just cargo and container ships. You can see a lot of community resupply that takes place. That's kind of movement of most of those tracks. Here, much the same. It's oil and gas tankers, also taking a lot of oil and gas out of places like Russia and Norway. So that's a bit of a glimpse of the Arctic, but let's kind of focus in more on the TransArctic shipping. We're starting to see more traffic now. In 2012, we saw a number of firsts that took place. We had crossing of both routes by actually private yachts. So we've got people going up there on these kind of solo trips. We've got tankers carrying oil and gas, condensate, liquid natural gas through the Northern Sea route. We actually had a TransArctic ferry that made its way. And finally, we also saw about a 53% increase in cargo volume between 2011 and 2012. So it's pretty incredible just over a short amount of time how we're seeing these increases. So this, I think at least, is a super cool map. Again, it's from WWF. And what you should do is keep an eye. This is sea ice extent represented by white. You're going to see it start to shift to blue. About every 2 to 3 seconds, it'll move forward 1 month. So keep an eye on kind of what happens here along the Northern Sea route, as well as what kind of happens here into the archipelago. And right at the very end, as sea ice starts to recover, you'll actually see some tracks of a icebreaker and a vessel going through those real shores. So it's January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, starting to close back up, October, November, and years. So just seeing one going through the actual ice there, which I personally think is pretty amazing. And what's even scary to think about is here you've got the Bering Strait, and as we all recall from Sarah Palin was running for office, you know there's not much distance between here. So you're going to have all the ships, all the marine mammals and whales migrating, everything trying to get through here, and hopefully not crash or kill each other. Just like oil and gas, shipping has a number of uncertainties associated with it, which makes it difficult to predict its future. As we've seen, climate change is reducing sea ice extent in the Arctic, and it's likely to continue. Keep in mind, though, that just because ice is shrinking, it doesn't necessarily mean crossing is going to be very easy per se. We still are going to have some nice chunks of ice floating around, what they did to the Titanic. You know, you hit an iceberg, you're going to be out of luck. You also only have less than 10% of the Arctic mapped with modern hydrographic charts, so you don't really know how shallow the water is in different places, which can be quite a problem. You don't know what's going to happen with things like the high insurance premiums for going through such a dangerous area. We saw a little earlier how the distance and time can be a lot shorter going through the Arctic, and some people point out the fact that by the Suez Canal, I'm sure you've heard some of the reports of the piracy that goes on there, and people have been promoting the Arctic cruise. They say, oh, well, there are no pirates up there. And I say back to them, well, you still had 17,000 boats that made it through the Suez Canal, pirates and all. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best judgment of whether we're going to see it. Lastly, I would just say one of the other uncertainties that we have, again, would be politics. I was talking about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There are certain provisions in there that allow you to take some stricter regulations in the Arctic. It allows you to sort of close off your internal waters. It allows you, if you have some ice-covered waters, to make stricter standards. There's a lot of debate, though, about the sort of nuances of those and how far you can go. The Canadians have been very aggressive in terms of closing off or trying to close off their waters, because, as I mentioned, they see this as potential for environmental disaster. But then there's been a lot of controversy over whether what they're doing is actually legally allowable under this convention. So we'll have to see where that plays out on the international front. And so the third one that I'd like to focus on in terms of activities is the status of fisheries. There's pretty robust fisheries that you're probably well aware of that take place in the Barents region, around Iceland, etc. A number of different species, and they're important not only just for things like commercial fisheries, but keep in mind the larger ecosystem, and there's a number of polar bears, seals, etc., that also live off of the fisheries resources in this area. Diminishing ice in the Arctic Ocean will open up new areas for plankton production up in the central Arctic Ocean, which may lead to new feeding areas for fish stocks. There's been a lot of hype and discussion about this. Okay, does that automatically mean just because there's new primary productivity, are the fish going to follow, and then on top of that, are the fishermen going to follow? But the science, unfortunately, is not quite as clear. We did have a colleague from NOAA and some of her colleagues as well that worked in this area and did a qualitative assessment, trying to look at 17 different commercial stocks and trying to determine if they would move into the central Arctic Ocean or not. There are a number of variations in the environment, and there are a number of uncertainties that were looked at during the study to see how they might impact whether the fisheries would shift. You can see some of them up here, things like water intrusions and layering and salinity and how that would balance out. Also looked at phytoplankton, kind of what its distribution would be, so the nutrient exchange that goes on, looking at climate variations and their influence on water temperatures. Some say the water is going to warm unevenly depending on where it is. And also have sort of the timing of food delivery, if that'll meet up with when the fisheries are shifting and whether they'll be able to sort of eat it at the right time. And then in order to determine the degree to which a species responds to some of these variations, they also had to look at the life history characteristics of these fishes. And this would help them gauge whether stock may survive to some of these challenging conditions that prevail up in the central Arctic Ocean. So some of the influential life history characteristics include things like, are they capable of avoiding unfavorable conditions because they already exhibit seasonal movements due to ice cover, the water temperature, or prey abundance? How flexible and diverse are the diets? Do they only feed on one thing, or are there many different species they might be able to eat? Do they have broad spawning range with low or moderate site fidelity? Like, do they have to go back to the same site each year, or do they just need like a rocky habitat and you can find a new one? And do their larvae or juveniles disperse far to enhance the chances for encountering favorable conditions? So, how far off do they scatter? And do they possess adaptive physiological characteristics such as blood antifreeze, which you actually find in polar cod? What the authors found in the Arctic when they qualitatively did this analysis of 15 fish stocks is that 5 stocks had low potential to move or to expand into the high Arctic. 6 species are considered a potential candidate to move or expand into the Arctic. And 6 stocks had a high potential of establishing a viable resident population. I got ahead of myself on slides. And so 6 species, although they might have some of these characteristics that will allow them to move into the central Arctic Ocean, this does not necessarily directly correlate with if they're going to be commercially viable. It just means they might be able to exist there, not necessarily at the levels which would allow them to be commercially fished. As you can see on this slide, here are some of examples of which species are either low, medium, or I guess potentially say, or high, and then what some of the barriers or facilitators are to their expansion, such as fidelity, do they tolerate lower temperatures, do they like specific prey or not. So if people are interested, I have a full list elsewhere that I'm happy to share with you. And then I know obviously a number of you are in school still, so if there's any of you that are still looking for the perfect master's or PhD topic, people involved in Arctic fisheries are never short on ideas, and I have a few pages on that too, which I'm happy to share with anyone if they're still looking. But here I just gave a few ideas of some of the things that they mentioned, understanding how climate change will impact ocean circulation, temperature, and sea ice loss, the extent to which climate change impacts primary productivity, and if it's going to restructure marine ecosystems at large, looking at sort of life stage and habitat linkages. So a number of different ideas, even down to things like analyzing the diets and species interactions. So now that we've looked at the status and trends taking place in the Arctic, what I'd like to focus on is more sort of the management side and some of the gaps and opportunities that take place there. But one of the things that I would need to highlight first is one of the organizations that's most active there. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the Arctic Council, and the way it's comprised, it's all 8 Arctic governments, and they are represented at the ministerial level that only meet about every 2 years. We had Secretary Clinton was our representative, the last one. A tier down at pretty much the ambassador level is senior Arctic officials. Deputy ministers, they meet sort of on an ad hoc basis. And then you have a number of working groups, which are really the engine behind driving this whole organization. They're looking at things like the monitoring of pollutants, trying to reduce them. You also have a group that's concerned more with spills, things. So they look at emergency prevention, preparedness, and response, and try to look at best practices, ways we can avoid those from happening. You have a group that's mostly focused on Russia and is trying to reduce the pollutants there, since we have such a huge problem with the Russians. You also have sustainable development, and that's looking at sort of the indigenous people that live there, and what are some of the programs that we can undertake to help them become more, economically sustainable, environmentally, living off the environment, making those sound for their sort of consumption. You have the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, which deals a lot with biodiversity, monitoring its state, and then you have more policy group that deals with protection of the Arctic environment. With this, we have indigenous people that sit at the table. They don't have any final say in the decision making, but they actually weigh into these processes, which is pretty unique to have that type of structure. And then you have another class called observers, which is where there's a lot of controversy these days that people may have heard about. It's where you have other non-Arctic governments, as well as international organizations. And since the Arctic has become such a popular place, everyone wants a piece of this. However, it's a little bit politically charged because you have groups like the European Union that wants to get in, but you also have a battle going on between Canada and the European Union on the sidelines because the Canadians club seals and Europeans have a ban against seal products. So this is where you start to see politics emerging into affecting how science and management can actually take place when you have all these sort of sidelines trickling in. Here is a meeting of an action, or a picture of an actual meeting. And when Trevor mentioned, people might be interested in hearing sort of what are negotiations like. And so there was an article that came out in the press relatively recently, about 6 months ago, that was actually talking about one of our meetings. So I'll read a quote from it because I didn't know if I should laugh or cry as someone else assesses what my life is like, but here it goes. The Arctic Council. It's a name that conjures up images of bearded explorers and snowstorms, of dog sleds and icicles, of polar bears and northern lights. So far, it sounds pretty good. But no, instead, it's 100 or so civil servants packed into a drafty room in a tiny town in northern Sweden, hearing reports from the likes of biodiversity monitoring programs. And yet, despite the soporific nature of much of the debate, despite the disappointingly bland attire of the attendees, despite the lack of any real drama, fantasy or otherwise, what's happening here is incredibly important. He goes on to say it's also an international organization that appears to work at a time when the US and Russia find it difficult to agree on much. At the Arctic Council, their ambassadors work together well, and all decisions are made by consensus. And I should probably emphasize the word consensus for a minute, because that's sort of another place where a lot of people get hung up. And a lot of times people create consensus with least common denominator. I hear it a lot. It means, okay, you can only go so far as the country that really doesn't want to do anything is willing to go. And indeed, that often can be a problem when we do negotiations. But on the other hand, it allows us the opportunity to talk about subjects when everyone knows that they're going to have a say and they're going to be able to weigh into what the final decision is coming out of any of these. On the other hand, I have to admit, not necessarily in Arctic, but I have had some pretty miserable experiences negotiating. I recall one time where we went from, I'm not joking, 2 a.m. till 6 a.m. negotiating over whether it was an ecosystem approach, meaning there's one type, or if it's the ecosystem approaches. So we were negotiating over about 3 letters for no joke, 4 hours throughout the middle of the night. So things get a little contentious. Some of the bigger four that I deal with are more dealing with the G77 and the developing countries, and the topic of high seas biodiversity and high seas marine protected areas. And again, that's something we've been going to the UN for 10 years straight now, and still have no outcome or product or agreement. So you can see, getting consensus. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I love the Arctic. It's usually a lot easier. You've got 8 countries, most of which are fairly like-minded and are fairly well off, so they can sort of, form different projects or programs to advance the knowledge in order to be able to get us somewhere. I also should say that if you have any desire to go into this line of work, you need definitely a lot of patience, probably a good sense of humor. If you want to get anything with the Colombians or any of the Latin countries, you have to be able to stay out drinking and dancing until the hours of the morning. It's the only way you can get them to vote in your direction. As long as you can do that, then it could do the job for you. So, and if you can be bland and super perfect at the same time. Marine shipping has to be, I'll get into some management of the actual activities, but marine shipping has to be one of the better regulated activities. Don't even bother trying to read all of it. The only reason I put up all these international agreements, because I'm not going to tell you about it because people will be asleep in about 2 minutes, but rather show you the comprehensive breadth with which shipping is covered. It's things like ship navigation and preventing collisions, safety standards for construction, equipment, and operation of ships, standards for pollutant discharge, dumping of waste, preventing transport of invasive species, liability and compensation, really full gamut. But what are we missing? Because there are definitely a few things that we are missing. One of the problems with shipping is that this is generic. This is for worldwide shipping. It doesn't take the Arctic in particular or the Antarctic into account. We've had some voluntary guidelines for a number of years addressing ice-covered shipping in particular, but it's now at the point that we're recognizing, hey, shipping is real and it's going to be happening in the Arctic, so what are we going to do about it? So right now, through something called the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, we are doing negotiations on a mandatory polar code. It's going to have 2 components to it. One is sort of the safety and design component, so does a ship have to be double hull? Do they have to have lifeboats and the suits in them for freezing cold weather, stuff like that? It also is going to be looking at the environment side, things like ship strikes with marine mammals, underwater ocean noise, how do we design a ship to be more quiet, invasive species, air emissions, some of those topics. So it's going to be hopefully fairly robust. It's taking a long time to get there. It's supposed to be done by 2014, but that's not looking like it's going to be the case. Another gap that we have that fortunately we've just filled is search and rescue. As we take stock of the fact that we're going to be having a lot of ships going through places like the TransArctic, there's not a lot around to help you. When you talk to Greenland, it's actually fascinating to watch them give a presentation on their search and rescue capabilities. Most of it is by dog sled. So if you go down, you're going to be waiting for a while, no joke, for a dog sled to get out somewhere to where you are. So what we just developed is a new agreement for search and rescue. And basically what it does is all the Arctic countries have designated sort of where their areas of having capability is, how we're going to help each other if there is some kind of accident or a ship goes down, all the sort of bureaucratic stuff about who's the person that you call, who repays, how do you move things across boundaries, because believe it or not, that's a problem. If you want to send new equipment, there's customs and other regulations, so it helps facilitate a lot of that. So search and rescue, we've made some good progress. That was through the Arctic Council, and it was adopted in 2011. And then one other thing that I should also mention is that we're doing a lot of work with respect to looking at heavy-grade fuel oil. So as we have more oil and gas development, we are worried about the use and carriage of heavy-grade fuel oil because of the way it's comprised versus sort of what they call lighter-grade fuel oil. If it spills in Arctic, we're in really bad shape. And so we're looking at, it's already been banned in Antarctica, and so now we're looking at the Arctic. It's probably unrealistic that we'd be able to completely ban it, but we're trying to look at some special regulations that we might be able to put in place on it. And the last thing that we've done related to shipping recently is we've done an assessment of where all the vulnerable habitats are Arctic-wide. And the next step is we're going to start looking at, can we take specific shipping regulations in order to try to help avoid some of these areas or not engage in certain shipping activities that would do damage to these sensitive habitats. Next, with offshore oil and gas management, here there are actually some gaps. You have some of the same agreements that apply to shipping that sort of cover aspects of oil and gas, but traditionally what the case is that industry, that we rely primarily on our domestic regulations, and so there aren't necessarily any international standards that are out there. Through the Arctic Council, we've had some voluntary guidelines for how you can do oil and gas drilling a little bit better, but there's no mandatory standards. It's something that we're talking about developing right now. There is some hesitation and reluctance by some countries that might be more engaged in it, but we are looking into the idea of having some international oil and gas standards that we could possibly do. The other thing that I should mention is our oil spill preparedness and response agreement. This also came out of the Arctic Council from the ministers with a mandate to do some kind of preparedness and response agreement. So similar to the search and rescue agreement, we work together as the Arctic countries, figuring out where are our sort of areas of expertise, how can we help respond in the event that there is an oil spill, having equipment across territories, etc. So that is expected to be signed actually in May of this year. So it's been finalized, and now we just need for the ministers to sign off on it. Here, fisheries I think is actually one of the interesting ones, especially since we don't know what the viability is of commercial stocks. I think with oil and gas and shipping, we have a lot more assurance that the probably is going to happen and can happen pretty soon. Likewise, you have an alphabet soup of treaties related to fisheries management, but in particular the one, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, that's what calls for the development of more regional-based organizations in order to specifically manage stocks in a particular area. In the Arctic, we have the Northeast Atlantic. We have an agreement that comes up partly into the Arctic, but by and large, the area that you see in red here in the Central Arctic Ocean, there's absolutely no agreement there. So if a commercial fishery did suddenly emerge, it could be a free-for-all because there is no regional fisheries management organization that currently exists there. The United States has been really active in trying to push for us to have some kind of maybe initial agreement, more of like a pledge where we say, okay, we're not going to fish until we have something in place, and in the meantime, we want to agree on some kind of scientific cooperation. How can we get together as Arctic countries to sort of share our knowledge, figure out a game plan in order to identify, are the fisheries moving there, will they, can they, etc. So hopefully more to come in the future on that, but right now we're going to look at where they can happen. Lastly, I just wanted to mention ecosystem-based management. It's a bit of a paradigm shift. I mean, for a long time now, we look at things in a very sort of sectoral, type way. We look at a little species, we look at a sector, etc. Instead, we've been trying in Arctic to look more broadly at the ecosystem at different scales, nesting them up and down, trying to figure out how the different species interact, and trying to look across some of our boundaries, because obviously an ecosystem doesn't just stop because of a political boundary. We've been doing a bunch of work in this regard, looking at what are some of the best practices, looking at how we might be able to better integrate our data, coming up with certain data standards. We had an expert group that was formed in the Arctic Council to look just specifically at this issue. It just developed some recommendations that will go forward to the ministers in May as well. And so just a few pictures. Here you see it, you know, I mean, if you don't believe in climate change, this is because normally you have sea ice protecting the shoreline, but now that the sea ice is disappearing, you have the waves hitting it, undercutting the shoreline, and communities actually literally falling into the sea. These are some of the seas that you sort of deal with when you're out there, so if you think shipping is easy, not the case at all. Oil and gas drilling, it looks like pristine environments. Let's hope it doesn't spill. And And this is sort of what you're looking at in places like Greenland in small communities. You've got fishing, you've got oil and gas, more to stock it up for the communities, and the numbers of you've got a fish processing plant, it's just a picture on the left side. So you can see sort of what you're looking at, a bunch of ice floating around in the water there, and as you can see, some boats in sort of random locations. And of course the iconic, what are the polar bears going to do if they don't have ice left from which to hunt? So kind of a sad state of affairs. And for those of you who are backcountry skiers, I'm telling you, the Arctic is just a dream come true. This is northern Sweden. It's called Kungsland, which means kind of King's Way. It's just, you can enjoy yourself. And that's pretty much it.
Questions before our social, so I'll let Elizabeth put the questions.
Do you know whether the United States has an opinion, what is the opinion about countries like China, Japan, Korea, wanting shipping?
Yeah, that I probably can't talk about. I mean, it's
Sorry.
As a means to, since you can't pass for a code at the moment and get anything through with the IMO, have you seen it shift at all with insurers? Like insurance of shipping through Arctic regions?
Yeah, I haven't personally followed that, so I guess I don't know entirely. From what I understand, the premiums are quite high. I think some things have been self-insured. Is that what you're getting at as well? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as a means to regulate,
as a means to regulate. Yeah.
As a way to, reduce risk in order to require more things to get insurance, or however that's working.
Yeah, that has not been a topic at least that I've been exposed to that's come up yet, but it's an interesting idea. I think sometimes that can be hard though when you're forcing private industry, I guess maybe like set their premiums at a certain level in order to reduce, but hopefully it close out the market. But we haven't done it yet.
So far, the public has basically been thinking about this motion in terms of shipping, I think, with the technical difficulty of mounting a platform up there and leaving it there safely in the winter. To me, it seems like it's totally formidable, and I recently read an article by a Russian scientist from the National Academy of Sciences that compared the technology difficulty to the same as sending someone to the Mars and back. Now, what type of safety testing and engineering mechanisms can be applied to assure that one of these things can stay there safely throughout a winter? Because if you look at a map, a movie of a moving ice floe throughout the winter, then there's ice 3, 4, 5 feet thick going right past where these things are going to be.
I fully support you. I'm on the green side, and I'm afraid industry sometimes wins out. There are obviously some procedures that they try to put in place in terms of testing, but whether you can do it accurately to the extent needed, I think it's okay. In the back.
Yes, it's pretty clear to me that any oil and gas exploration in the Arctic should be completely banned or prohibited. We know the Russians are spilling millions of gallons every year into the Arctic Sea. It goes unreported, there's no control. We saw with Shell the incredible string of mishaps and fiascos last summer, and the grounding of the Kaluk off Alaska a few weeks ago, and Shell announced yesterday it was going to postpone any drilling until 2014. It makes absolutely no sense to drill in the Arctic. Is there any way, or what would it take to create a reserve in the Arctic, an international reserve, banning all resource extraction just like is the case in the Antarctic?
Yeah, I think what it's going to take is the development of a new resource that can be used for energy. I hate to say it, but I don't foresee there's always going to be some kind of development there. And as much as what we're trying to do, though, is at least figure out where are the most sensitive and vulnerable habitats in order to try to get restrictions in place, whether you're setting up marine protected areas, whether you're setting up ship routing zones, etc. So at least we can try to minimize some of the damage that could result from something like an oil and gas spill or blowout. But at the present time, just given the demand for energy, that's not something that's on the table.
You mentioned that mandatory polar code negotiations were moving slower than expected. Do you know some of the reasons for that? Are there particular topics that people disagree over, or particular countries disagree with each other?
Yeah, there's some countries, I think some of the flag states that might not actually even be Arctic states, but have strong shipping interests, or countries like Panama. It just takes time. There's a fairly large breadth of issues that they're covering. Some of it is knowing more about the technology, because literally they are getting down to the point of determining what ship holes should be like, you know. And so in order to do that, you have to sort of send stuff back to maybe a research committee, and then it comes back to the decision-making body. So it's a combination of both just being a lot of issues and a lot of technical issues, as well as I think there are maybe some countries that are afraid of what regulations could do.
The Ilulissat Declaration basically says that the law of the sea treaty is enough to carry it. And I'm now trying to answer the question the way we just won't say I can't answer. So a lot of people have suggested maybe this will fall under the general impact. Maybe we do need a special regime treaty specific to the Arctic. And I guess the question is, what do you think about that? And is it being thought about? And if you're going to do that, like what would it address? And I guess, you know, does the U.S. have an idea of what you would try to cover if you could get nations involved in the discussion of a treaty of some sort?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you my personal view, but I think just from sort of the international, what's on the table, right now it's, I think, looking at things more as I've described in terms of a sectoral basis, trying to look at what some of the biggest threats are, and then trying to identify what management measures we can take. If we're ever going to have something like the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Mechanism and HAMWA underneath it, I'm not sure that's where the Arctic crowd is willing to go. Some of the comparisons or reasons given for that is down in Antarctica you have a very interesting situation. We had a number of competing claims but no real ownership. And so what they did is they almost kind of resolved it as like a peace park for everyone, for science, etc., and it's still allowing fishery in its periphery. In the Arctic you have a very different situation. Instead of having land surrounded by water, you've got water surrounded by land, and it's a place that's inhabited, it's used. So don't, as much as I personally, and I know my former administrator who just departed unfortunately, those were some things that we would love to have seen, but it's not something that's being advocated at this time.
Couple more questions?
Last question. More fundamentally than changing the Arctic Council, do you think that UNCLOS has to be modified in any way to take into account new scenarios in the Arctic?
No, I think it's flexible enough. I mean, UNCLOS is so comprehensive in what it covers, and then coming from it, I mean, you have a number of other more sectoral specific treaties that sort of help support it. I think what it's going to boil down to is more clarifying and interpreting things like Article 234, where you're talking about ice-covered waters and how those interpretations are made, more so than like you would something. Doug?
Yeah, there's currently a moratorium on Arctic fishing in the U.S. Arctic, at least north of the Bering Strait. That only applies in federal waters and only in the U.S. Is there a companion moratorium in the state waters and also in international waters?
No, the international waters is sort of what the U.S. is trying to do. We would like to see that. I don't know if you call it an extension or more just taking the same idea and moving it to the Central Arctic Ocean. None of the other governments have something like that, and so we're trying to sort of advocate for a precautionary approach. And until we have the right science, until we have the right management in place, doing the same and basically having a moratorium in the Central Arctic Ocean.
What about the state waters?
I don't unfortunately deal with international states. Well, I'll find it out for you though.
it's time for